folks. You're listening to The Idea Roastery. I'm Herman.
And I'm Jason.
Jason, what do you think of? What's the immediate emotional reaction that you get when someone suggests that you should self-host something?
It starts off with what, right? Um, I think there's a couple of factors that I think about. It's the complexity of hosting it. There's some things that are just really complicated. I guess email servers that I just
I have
don't
no interest
don't
in hosting.
don't. Yeah. Or yeah. I mean, if you think about all the software that we use in our day-to-day life, like all of that, there's a theoretical way of self-hosting all of it, right? The other thing is the costs, right? So I think I'm at the point where I'm not looking to save that much costs that I'm willing to go down the rabbit hole of hosting things that don't really need doing that. So if there's a service that provides it, that's where I will go to that service rather than host it myself. But also, I'm not that well off that there are some services where they are just extortionately priced, at which point I'm like, hell yeah, I'm going to get my VPS spun up and I'm going to just install it myself. And then I guess it also depends on the software itself, right? Because I think I think more and more that it's becoming harder and harder to find software that meets the needs that I have. And so there's a couple of reasons why I'd look to self-host, but I don't know if it's the same for you.
It's similar. I think that there's a part of me that just really liked the idea of self-hosting. It's that, growing up in the 90s hacker mentality where you are in control of the box that it's running on and the data, and you don't mind getting, a little bit stuck into the weeds. So you've got that like control, and I guess to a certain extent you've also got that privacy because, you're not hosting your stuff on someone else's service, right? So like let's say for instance you are using someone else's analytics service. They theoretically have complete access to your analytics dashboard, and if that is important, then they essentially have unfettered access to something that is important to you and potentially sellable by them. And in all these cases, companies tend to act well until they don't.
Mm.
um, but I think there's also that sort of freedom to choose and to hack.
Yeah, so you mentioned analytics tool. I mean, so when I think of analytics, that's not something that I would look to self-host myself, right? Because I guess,
Because it's terribly complicated.
yeah, I think that's part of the way that we live now, right? There's certain things that I think have been taken care of for us and almost have become standards, right? So when I think of analytics, I obviously think of Google Analytics, and even up until a couple of months ago when I started going into sort of more indie hacking and that kind of stream of thought. I didn't even know there were that many alternatives. Really, I was just like, well, it's kind of the big one. Everyone uses it, but I've also realized that since then they've actually changed the UI, and I think a lot of people are pissed off with that there's like a different UI, and then obviously like now there's like the privacy conscious centric approaches to that, because I think Google Analytics, they were using sort of weird pixel stuff and tracking you across different sites. I think Meta were doing something similar.
Yes, it's that because if Google is such a large company that has scripts running on so many different websites, they can theoretically fingerprint you and then they can track you specifically across the web and they can see exactly where you go. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem for the person who's running Google Analytics on their site. It's just kind of shitty to the people who use their site because now they are being fingerprinted by Google your on their continuous journey through the web.
Mm.
And that's why Google offers such a comprehensive analytics tool for free, is because the amount of insight that they can gain from this is incredible. And they just offer a couple of nice graphs to marketers as a reward for allowing them to fingerprint their customers.
Yeah, and I also liked what you said about the hacker mentality, right? Like I think this is something that I feel has come about because of people working in companies. So when you work in companies, there's generally there's always been like a break between the people who write software and the people who deploy software. So in old school terms, it was ops who were deploying stuff, and then you had software developers. And it feels like when you look online, and might just be a perception, is that everyone's kind of more in the software developer world. They're all posting pictures of like their cool algorithms. They're like using AIs to like create all this code and stuff. But there's not that much talking about the actual how do you deploy this stuff in a way that's like scalable and secure. And I think it's maybe that, like, some people say even the reason why JavaScript is so prevalent is just because like anyone can pick it up, and maybe people shouldn't all be able to do that, because it's just like you can have this whole mess of code, but then actually deploying it efficiently is like a completely different thing. And I think it's even to the point that people shy away from, maybe the Mac users, but people shy away from things like Linux to like understand some of the commands that are available. I know even when I was doing some ops kind of role before, like even things like systemd and like how that works was like a little bit unknown to me, and to some extent I didn't even need to know it because there's now like layers of abstraction above it. But I think, yeah, as you pointed out, there is this sovereignty aspect where at some point you may need to have a level of control that your provider doesn't necessarily offer you. And at that point, if you don't have those skills, you're kind of going to be left high and dry, right? You've kind
Mm.
of almost been locked in to that solution just by the fact that you don't know how to actually deploy this code from scratch.
Especially if it's a proprietary system. So, like, if you are doing something with Google specific databases versus, something open source like Postgres that you can theoretically run on your own machine, is you are now stuck on Google server. And if you ever do want to uh, use someone else's service or spin up your own, home lab, um, getting the data off of there, you're going to have to do a full data migration and change the schema to the new database type as opposed to just, do
Mm.
a PG dump and off you go. Um, and so there's another thing over there is that there are cost considerations, and it comes down to a couple of things. It comes down to how much you value your time, and also how big you are, right? So if you are just getting started and you just need to, make something quick and get it up and running, hey, use some of the managed solutions. A lot of them have really cheap or even free solutions to get you started. The problem comes is when you start scaling that up, it starts becoming incredibly expensive. So, for instance, something that would cost you, you know, $200 a month on Heroku, which is a managed platform that runs on top of AWS, you could reasonably run that on a $6 a month VPS with DigitalOcean or Vercel. But then you also have to spend the multiple days getting it up and running stably, and you have to spin up your own like logging and monitoring and reporting tools. And so it doesn't actually make sense to save the $194 per month, because $194 per month is not more than the amount of time that you would have to spend as a developer to set that up correctly. However, if you can save $10,000 per month by spinning up your own stuff, well, that's a whole developer salary, right?
Mm.
So you're like, might as well go and do some self-hosting over there. But I think that's also like company kind of self-hosting, and then there's like personal self-hosting where it's like you and your home lab, where you've got like your Jellyfin for your media streaming, and you've got your Bitwarden to host your passwords and stuff like that.
I think some people enjoy it, but what you touch on there is, I think, maybe where people need to, when building a system, I think people always need to start with their most reasonable set of assumptions of how big their system is going to be. And I saw this a lot when I was advising startups, is that they'd come in and they've got literally no users, but they want to build the infinitely scaling system,
Yeah.
right? And especially when with working with AWS, you've got things like serverless, you've got lambdas, and they advertise like, infinite scale, and you can like scale, but like the problems that you see at talks and stuff like reInvent, you'll see like, how they solve the scaling problem with microservices and all those event driven architectures. And people go in because they see that that's like the sort of best practice, that they should be applying that at the scale that they are, when it's just like no users or even like 100 users. And I think that's where people start to like over engineer and they look to more hosted solutions. Whereas if you know that you don't, I always say like, what's your expectation in like 2 years? Like, how big do you need to be? And just try and build for that. And then generally at like 10 times or 10 times that number of people or users, that's when you start to need to re-architect. And what you re-architect is just what you need to get to the 100 times that scale, right? So it's not like you're not
Yeah.
building these infinitely scalable systems. And in that case, it makes sense just to have an EC2 instance, a VPS, and maybe you can have, you can get your access logs from Nginx, or you can pull some stuff from, logging that's provided by some of these services. And you don't actually need to build all this like rubbish, like excess stuff. And you don't need to over engineer it. And that's where like self-hosting can sometimes work for you because it's cheaper. It just works. You don't have to have like this complicated setup. And I think people just need to learn to fit into those constraints and say like, okay, we don't need to build this cool tech. We could just do it with a, VPS, or we can just, track the number of requests into our site.
Yeah, I think this whole premature optimization is actually problematic, but I also get the feeling that it's pushed by these companies because the more people they can get to prematurely optimize, the more services they can sell to them.
It's not actually that. I think there's another aspect to it, because I think it's when you're looking to hire developers are these weird beasts that they don't want to be. If you put
You
on
don't want
on
to be
your
not
job
cool.
description like EC2, like Java and like CSS, HTML, no one's gonna go for that job except for like an old guy who probably has a beard like right down to his belly button.
That's all I code in.
And so there's almost like a like like developers want to learn about like Kubernetes. They want to learn about these cool new technologies because they want to be seen as more relevant in the field. And so it's almost like they use that as a draw card to get like some of the best developers into, or the most innovative developers into the company. And so sometimes you can kind of tell that it's not really there for the need of the application itself, because the application would do fine with like just a HTTP server on a box like somewhere in the internet. And so I think there's also like a developers both want to learn those technologies, but also that's being put on those job descriptions because they want to attract developers. So it's kind of like this weird like catch-22 that drives people to want to do that.
Yeah, no, I do completely agree with you over there, and I think it's also one of those things where younger developers or like earlier, especially in the entrepreneurial front, um, they don't necessarily understand that building fast is significantly more useful than building for scale. And when scale becomes a problem, you'll have enough of a stream of
Yeah.
income to deal with that. And so there's a
But
sort of
there's
off the cuff example is I started building a system in Go because I wanted it to be like super, super fast. And I managed to build the first iteration of it in Go and it was super fast, but boy, was it slow in me getting there. And to add any features, boy, like it just took so much time because I had to keep on like adding these different libraries and everything just for like very basic things. I went and I rewrote it all in Django in like 2 or 3 hours, and now I can iterate on it incredibly fast. But like Python is significantly slower than Go because it's not a compiled or strongly typed language. But I can build so much faster on it.
I find it comes to like things like memory management as well. I was building something recently, and I'm using some language called Elixir, and I'm like, oh, I've got to like, I can't have too much of a, because it stores a lot of its state in memory, and so I've got like these small like objects, and they're like maybe like 5 or 6 like elements, and they've got a little bit of text for each one. I'm like, oh, I've got to try and like optimize this down because I'm going to run out of memory. But then I like calculate, I'm like, I could have like millions of these things at once, and it would still just fit into like 512 of RAM. And so I'm like, okay, I don't need to like prematurely optimize on memory on object storage either.
Dude, exactly this. So here, this brings me to, so I'm currently, as you know, putting together a very basic analytics system, just for web analytics for a couple of my projects. Is that I use another service that's really good. It's called Fathom. It's also privacy respecting and everything, and there are a couple of those kicking around in the space. Some of them which are open source. Things that I tried to actually host some of those open source ones myself, but they were so complicated because they run ClickHouse and they uh, have to have, your celeries and your Redises and all these services need to talk to each other very gracefully. And I couldn't actually figure it out. So I'm like, let me do it where the consideration is that it's just going to be a basic Django application with very, very limited dependencies. No celery, no Redis, no Postgres even. I'm doing it purely using a SQLite database with a read ahead log or write ahead log while mode. No. Um, and I went and I calculated what the sort of maximum that this thing will handle, and it's like if my I have it currently running on Just Sketch Me just to test when Just Sketch Me gets 150,000 page views a month. Um, I would have to have like 100 Just Sketch Me's running on this one instance for it to A, not be able to handle those requests fast enough, and B, the SQLite database will only get to like 5 or 6 megabytes. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like it's infinitesimally small, and I'm like, oh, we gotta architect this better. No, 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 no. Turns out you don't.
Yeah, but I guess in that case, yeah, again, you're like kind of defining like, okay, I only need to have a certain amount of users, and I think the reason why those other systems are using things like ClickHouse is because those are like proper like analytics databases, and their use case would probably suit someone who's more like an enterprise person who just wants to self-host it because of like sovereignty cost issues.
Mm,
But I think the other point that is important to talk about is the idea of, although you've got control over what you're doing, it's not necessarily the case that you're going to have the most secure setup. And I think this is something that's caught a couple of people in the indie hacking space recently. I think there was one dude. Okay, to be fair, it was his code, his app, where you could just, I think you could just like swap the URLs, or you could like, just change the link or something, and you would be able to see other people's whatever it is in the application. So similar to like the creating your own software for stuff, like the security aspect also becomes important, because when you self-host things, you have to take care of things that are not necessarily what you think they you need to, like patching your system. Like, if there's an SSH bug, you don't want to have that on your system because people will be able to get in. And then there's also like intrusions, and even like, if you're managing data on behalf of other users in any state, you might still have to think about GDPR and those kind of things. And so there's a lot of like maybe hassly stuff that comes in when you need to secure the system. And maybe that's, I guess, if it's only for yourself and you're able to sort of cordon it off in like a VPC, like you can do on AWS, that's maybe a bit better. But I think the security aspect is hard to ignore when it comes to self-hosting.
you're definitely right. It's
Yeah.
easy to shoot yourself in the foot, especially if you're inexperienced. Um,
Yeah.
and there isn't a correct path to do it, or at least there isn't an enforced path to do it. Whereas,
Yeah.
like someone who is using a hosted service, the service provider, it is in their best interest that everything is set up correctly so that
Yeah.
you don't get hacked and you don't have your, SSH keys available in a public space or something like that, right?
Mm.
I mean, like I have um, tens of thousands of bots every day trying to scrape all of Bear's web endpoints for .aws files, .ssh files,
Mm.
.pwd files, .config files that are just like lying around. And I don't really have to worry about that because I know that it is set up correctly. And I've
Yeah.
also recently gone and just put block everything that smells even remotely like a bot. Um,
Mm.
and put the whole like I am human sort of JavaScript challenge over there. But it's it it is definitely very easy to mess yourself over. So, despite me actually enjoying self-hosting things, it isn't my first recommendation for people. My first
Mm.
recommendation for people, especially if they're just starting out, is to use a service, use a managed service, and run with that until it becomes too expensive. And hopefully by then you're actually making some good money and have more
Mhm.
experience and you know where to go.
Yeah. I think like yeah, I was also gonna get into like some like recommendations, right? Because I guess it depends on what your goal is as as an individual, right? If you're looking to be an indie hacker and like make money off it, then as you say, like go for it, go build up a list of SaaS products that you use as and host it there, because in that case your idea is it's basically like how fast can you get it to market and start
Mm,
getting people using your system. But I'd also advocate um, trying to like trigger your inner curiosity. I think like try hosting some of these things. Like so try like, set up like a self-hosted, I don't know, like a FTP server, or try and set up like a, self-hosted email server, and try and do this every now and again, just so that you can have this, you can start to understand how systems work, especially things that like restarting a process and how do you manage that. And especially for junior developers, I think it's important to get back into that hacker mindset, because
mhm.
even though people say yeah, software is all going to be written by AIs, and you're going to have all these SaaS platforms, I think it is quite sad if as a community of people writing code that we forget how to use Linux and like use all of the cool features that have been baked in, then it's it's going to be a loss on the whole sort of industry, because you'll maybe have certain companies that are able to do that, or people, and then you'll have to consult with them, right?
Yeah, I mean, as a bit of a tangent over there, I recently installed Cursor, which is that AI powered IDE.
Yeah.
And it just generates code for you. And then you say like, no, just do it a little bit differently. And then it generates some more code for you. And then you like look at it and then you say, okay, now make it do this. And then you say the output isn't right. And then it, generates some more code. And so I generated a bunch of code. And then after a while, I realized that I have no idea what's going on in this code. It was as if it was written by someone else. And so I had very little idea of how to debug it myself. And so I actually became reliant on the AI to
Mm.
essentially manage that code for me. And so I went and I canceled my Cursor subscription. And I got an email from the one of the founders of Cursor. I know it's an automated email, but it's just like, hey, like sad to see you go. We'll offer you a refund if you need it. Can you let us know like what happened? I'm like, it's because I literally didn't know what was going on in my code anymore. Yeah, you like it worked, but I don't know why.
And I mean, just on Curses more specifically, I've seen there's um it will like double down on errors, right? So it will have like a minor syntax error that you can't quite spot, because like it's just generated and it kind of works. But then as you go down, as you tab more and you add more elements to it, you're like, it's starting to build on this like error, and then like all of a sudden it's like, okay, it runs but it's not working, and I don't quite know where
Yeah.
it's working. And then all of a sudden I'm like having to debug the code, and then I'm like, oh shit, it's like this object has got the wrong field or something like that.
I couldn't even get to that. I'm like, I don't know what was written, so I don't know where to start debugging. I have to go and learn everything that has been written so that I can start debugging my own application. I'm like, you know what? I've been programming for a good, 10 plus years. I can do this myself.
Yeah, I think it's a like yeah, similar to like the Linux argument. I think Cursor helps like it helps you if you already know how to program. I think it's going to be really detrimental if you don't
Yeah.
know how to write code, because yeah, it can like get stuff done, but you don't you might be introducing bugs, you might be introducing security flaws, and even just as like Cursor's not going to build the whole application for you yet. And you don't want to, I mean, I don't want to take that risk that there's like a security flaw that's been introduced by the AI. And yeah, maybe that's
No, I completely agree with
just
you.
my
I
thing.
completely agree with you.
I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about is just I guess this in the vein of self hosting. I found that a couple of things. or projects where this is maybe back to what our previous conversations on open source and open source to closed source models, right? Because there are some companies that have a good product, like Next.js, where you can self-host it. Strappy has another one. You can self-host it, but it's really complicated to self-host. So,
Same with Superbase,
yeah, same with Superbase.
and also same with Plausible, which is the analytics tool that I was
Yeah,
trying to self-host.
I don't know if this is a tactic that they use, and I can make arguments for both sides because it could just be that, progress they're making, their business is about like making the best tool for their users, and the users who pay are usually the ones that they're building for. And this self-hosting element is almost like a side quest. It's like it's not really their main thing, but they're available for people to do. But in trying to host Next.js, it's got all this like complicated machinery. And I don't know if this is like a practice that they're doing, or if it's just that they're not really interested in that open source element. And in some cases, that's actually pushed me away from projects like that. And this is almost coming back to like an idea of simplicity, where even though it's self-hosted, or it has a self-hosted option, I'm still going back to the old tech, right? The Postgres, the
Mm-hmm.
like HTTP servers, Nginx, like these kind of tools that are like they're old school, but they're kind of like tried and tested and relatively easy to set up.
Yeah, so I had the same thought, um, and it feels to me like they're making it more difficult. But I know that in practicality they're actually not. Like they're just not incentivized to make it easy. Instead, what they're doing is they're incentivized to make the projects that they are selling as tantalizing to potential customers as possible. And so they can feature stuff it and they can add more and more complication and bloat because it makes their offering more featureful, even if it comes at the cost of making the self-hosting aspect of it worse. And so I don't think they're being bad. I think they are just following the incentive structures that are set up. And to be entirely honest, is like I don't think that they're open source because they want you to self-host. That is the antithesis of their business. I think they are open source because they want,
Mm-hmm.
firstly, good brownie points with the developer community. And second, it does keep companies honest. It allows the code to be auditable. When they say, hey, listen, we don't track your users, people can go and look at the code and say, they don't actually track their users. They can say, you know, we actually don't even store any PII. And they can say, oh yeah, I see that you just do some stuff in memory and then you discard it. Neat. And so
Mm-hmm.
there are other reasons for things to be open source other than people self-hosting them. But in many cases, things are actually too difficult to self-host, even though they are open source.
Yeah, or too complicated, right? I think the other thing that just came to mind as you were saying that, I think it's recently Okta, like this identity provider company. If you had a username that was over like 255 characters or something ridiculous like that, it didn't ask for a password, or any password would have worked. And it's because how they hashed their passwords. It was like they would just join it together, and then they would like hash it. So because the algorithm, I think the max characters that it takes into account is like 255, then any password would have
Mhm.
worked for a username. And so that's like an indication of like it's a service that's being provided. It's supposed to be a security service, and it's not secure. And so there's almost like an element of like, should I self-host it? But then if you look at like things like OAuth and like OpenID and all this kind of crap, it's actually just like so complicated to understand. Like, I mean, I've tried to implement OAuth before, and it's just really messy stuff. And that's where maybe it, like for security, it probably is there for a reason. Same with emails. Like now you have to have certificates and you have to have all this stuff because there's been this like explosion of spammers. And so it's like in some cases, like you don't know quite where to go, because I would have used Okta because I don't want to do security myself, but then they also have, bad security. So it's kind of like, yeah,
Yeah.
again, you're like kind of trusting the company behind it. And in that point, it's like you're going to go for the people who have been doing it for a lot longer, that are maybe more established, like more trustworthy, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's like some cases like where it's too complicated, it's just really hard to decide which way to go.
Yeah, and I think we can end off by just saying, don't try and spin your own email server.
Or try it, but don't run it forever.